So here it is, the Meshlicious custom loop with an RTX 3080 and Ryzen 5950X, and honestly, after not touching hardline tubing for a very long time, this turned out a lot better than I was expecting, especially in such a compact form factor. But today we're going to take a look at all of the parts that went into this, and of course answer the big questions, such as how does this actually perform with just a single 280mm radiator, and then of course one of the big questions was how can all of this possibly be powered by just a 600 watt power supply. So let's take a look. So we have to start with the case first because some of you might not be familiar with it because it hasn't been fully released and shipped yet, but it is the SUPT Meshlicious, which I think we can agree is a very fatiguing name for a PC case, but at least there is a lot here to get excited about. It's a vertically oriented ITX case coming in at around 14.5 liters in volume, and with that can support up to a 280mm radiator and some of the biggest graphics cards on the market. Not only that, but evidently a pretty decent hardline custom loop as well. The vertical form factor keeps the footprint on your desk nice and small, and the mesh panels allow a ton of air to pass through the case. The GPU that we're using here is the RTX 3080 Founders Edition, and installed onto that is the special edition water block from EK that I reviewed in a previous video. And it's an absolutely epic looking combination there, which is also super compact, allowing a full pump res combo to be mounted right above, but more on that in just a minute. The CPU that I went with here is probably a little bit overkill. It's the 16-core Ryzen 5950X, and I've plugged that into the ASUS X570i Strix with 32GB of memory and a little over 1TB of M.2 NVMe storage. And some of you might have noticed, but I did actually have to swap out the memory kit halfway through the build to something that was a little bit shorter than what I was using initially, otherwise there just wasn't enough room for the tubing. Speaking of which is 16mm PETG hardline tubing all throughout, and that's connected with EK's torque fittings in the same color as the GPU block. Overall, not too many hassles or mistakes with the tubing and the bends, but a few of these runs were really tricky, like the one that connects the CPU outlet to the reservoir and goes up and around the top of the build through 3 different 90-degree bends in a single run. And also the really tight 180-degree bend that connects the pump outlet to the GPU inlet. Both of these were super tricky to do, but I think it really takes this build to the next level. My favorite part of the build by far is the top section of the GPU side with this special edition water block and reservoir mounting right above it. It really creates this unique section of the loop that I've never seen in any other custom water-cooled build. I've also used extender fittings on both radiator ports and on one of the GPU ports just to make the tubing runs there a little bit more straightforward. Overall though, really happy with the way that everything has turned out. Now speaking of that radiator, the one I'm using here was a very deliberate choice because it's the biggest one that I could find that fits in this case. It's the EX280 from XSPC. It comes in at 36mm thick, and along with a pair of regular thickness fans, it is quite the squeeze to install in this case, with barely a couple mils of clearance left over. But now let's get to the pump and reservoir mounting that I've mounted at the top of the build here, which is the VTX 120 from EK. The mounting here is actually completely improvised. I basically just opened up 2 of the existing ventilation holes that were already there with the drill, and the screws happened to line up perfectly. Now personally, I would only really recommend this style of pump res mounting in this case as a complete last resort, because having it this high in the loop, it does cause some problems. So again, last resort, if you can't figure out how to mount at least the pump somewhere lower, which there is room down here in front of the GPU block, you could do it, but I think we can all agree that this looks just so much better. The problem here is that having the pump at the very top of the build and mounted horizontally, it is very easy for small air bubbles to get sucked into the pump and, create a really noisy operation. There is one way to overcome this though, and it's exactly what I've done with this loop, and it's basically just to make sure that the reservoir is completely topped up and that there's no air in the loop whatsoever, which does take a little bit of time, but it is definitely possible. Here's an idea of what the pump sounds like after the loop is completely topped up. I'll also note the coolant that I'm using here is EK's opaque cryofuel in Azure. Really nice and vibrant, especially with the Saturn fittings and the water block. The loop has been running for around 4 days on and off now, and thankfully there's no discoloration or anything like that to note. But by far, one of the biggest concerns that you guys had with this build was the fact that I was only using a 600 watt SFX power supply, and that was obviously not enough for a Ryzen 5950X and an RTX 3080. So I definitely would have used the 750 250 watt SF750 from Corsair for this build, but I just didn't have one spare if I'm honest, and my previous testing with the RTX 3080 showed it to be more than fine with a 600 watt power supply. So let's see if that's the case here too. Well, in Blender, we see around 265 watts of power draw at the wall. That's also with the power limit of the 5950X raised from around 142 watts to 180 watts, and in heavy GPU loads like Firmark and Heaven, we see the power draw at around 470 to 480 watts. So at this load, we're well below the capabilities of the SF600 Platinum that we're using here. What I did not expect though was to be able to run the CPU and GPU completely maxed out at the same time, Blender and Firmark running simultaneously. At this point, we are looking at over 600 watts of power draw at the wall. Again, this was with the Ryzen 5950X running a small overclock as well. So evidently, if you already have an SF600 Platinum on hand, or you can't get an SF750 at a decent price, then you will be absolutely fine pairing an RTX 3080 with the SF600 Platinum, especially if you're planning on undervolting the GPU to save on power and thermals, which is something that I definitely recommend for pretty much all ITX water-cooled builds. But let's get to the big question, which is of course thermal performance. How does this thing perform with just a single 280mm radiator, which you can see at the front there, and the fans I've got kind of pulling air into the case to get the freshest and coolest air passing through the radiator. That's not what you'd do if you were air cooling the GPU. You'd have the fans in reverse because you'd be encouraging air through the side panels instead. But this airflow setup surprised me a lot, and the results here are really, really good. But yeah, 280mm rad crammed into an ITX case, and I've also done all of the testing with one of the tempered glass side panels because that's how most meshlicious cases will be shipping. So with the two 140mm fans set to 1300 RPM and the pump set to just 2500 RPM, the RTX 3080 settles in at just 51 degrees C. That is seriously good performance. Even when we reduce the fans to just 900 RPM, we're still sitting at a very comfortable temperature. And this isn't even factoring in GPU undervolting, which I've previously shown can reduce thermals by a further 5 to 10 degrees. I mean, even if you wanted to run a bit of an overclock here on the GPU, you've definitely got the thermal headroom to do so. So at this point, I was very curious to see how this custom loop compares to my own RTX 3090 water-cooled build in the Ncase M1, which uses two 240mm radiators. So I ran the same test on both, Witcher 3 running at 4K for 30 minutes, with both builds having the fan set to 1300 RPM. This isn't exactly a one-to-one comparison. Obviously, we're comparing a 350 watt RTX 3090 to a 320 watt RTX 3080, but I think this does honestly show that the custom loop in the Meshlicious has more cooling capability than my Ncase build. Despite having less overall radiator capacity, it does have a more straightforward airflow path as opposed to my Ncase, which I think we can admit is a lot more dense and has a more challenging pathway for airflow. So overall, super impressive performance here. As for CPU thermals, there's absolutely nothing to worry about here. Our Ryzen 5950X running at 180 watts settles in at just 67 degrees C here after 30 minutes of rendering out a scene in Blender, and that was with the fan set to just 900 RPM. As for system noise, here's an idea of what you can expect. So honestly, a pretty quiet loop, and we're not even using special fans or anything like that. These are just EK Vada 140s. The loudest part of this build though would have to be the chipset fan on the Asus X570i Strix motherboard. As the chipset heats up to over 80 degrees C, that fan eventually spins up to over 7000 RPM. You can apparently fix this with aftermarket thermal pads for the chipset, but I'd probably just recommend going for the B550i version instead, which doesn't require active chipset cooling. I'll also note the clock speeds on this board, along with the 5950X, have been improved a fair bit since the last time I tested, with all cores now landing at around the 4 GHz mark out of the box in Blender. You can raise this a little bit in the BIOS quite easily by setting the performance enhancement mode to level 1, which raises the CPU power to around 180 watts and clock speeds to around 4.4 GHz. Another thing that I'd recommend doing with this build, which I have not done here, would be adding a coolant sensor just as I've done with my Ncase M1 and having the fan curve completely completely based off of that. I'll leave a video link down below on everything you need to know regarding how to do that, but it is something I definitely recommend. So some of you are probably wondering at this point whether I'm going to be using this as my main system, or maybe transplanting the parts from my NCase M1 to the Meshlicious. And honestly, I did really consider it, mainly because I think we can agree this just looks so good. As a showpiece, this would look fantastic on my desk. There's also the fact that the footprint is a little bit smaller than my NCase M1, and the build is a whole lot simpler thanks to only using a single radiator. And again, just looks so good. But if I'm being honest with myself, looking at the thermal performance, I'd probably see about a 5-degree thermal improvement at the same noise levels, and I just don't think that's going to be worth tearing down a build that's completely fine just for a 5-degree improvement. So for now, I will be sticking with my NCase M1, but if I was starting from scratch and I had to choose between the two cases and the two potential builds, this is probably what I would go with. So I think that pretty much covers everything about this custom build. This is pretty much the last video that I'll be doing on it. So a lot of you guys ask what happens now, like with these builds. Simple answer is this will be torn down and the parts will be used for future builds. And I do have a future build that I want to do with this exact water block and GPU, so stay tuned for that. Other than that, I will link all of the parts listed down below. A huge thanks for watching, and I will see you all in the next one.